The air did not smell of death, not yet. It smelled of ozone and the terrified sweat of a million souls realizing simultaneously that the world had ceased to turn on its axis. Behdala stood at the window of his fourth-floor apartment, the glass vibration against his fingertips a constant, thrumming testament to the chaos erupting on the streets below. It was day 1, hour 0. The sky was a bruised purple, the sun choking behind a thick curtain of industrial smog, and the rising plumes of black smoke that spiraled up from the city center like twisted fingers clawing for salvation. He hadn't slept. No one had. The emergency broadcast system had been screaming a singular, monotone tone for 3 hours, a digital flatline that replaced all music, all news, all comfort. Behdala turned from the window, his movements sluggish, weighed down by a psychological gravity that felt heavier than the tactical vest he had instinctively pulled from the back of his closet, a relic from a life he thought he had left behind. The leather of his boots creaked, a harsh sound in the suffocating silence of the room, a silence that existed only in contrast to the muffled roar of the city outside. He looked at his hands. They were trembling, not from fear, but from an adrenaline overdose, a chemical cocktail his brain was mixing in anticipation of violence. He grabbed his pack, the canvas rough and weathered, the straps frayed at the edges. Every object he placed inside felt significant, heavy with the portent of finality. A bottle of water, a flashlight with rusted contacts, a heavy iron pipe he had wrenched from the plumbing under the sink, the metal cold and biting against his palm. The door to his apartment, usually a barrier against the mundane annoyances of neighbors, now stood as the last fortification against an unknown abyss. He reached for the handle, the brass tarnished and slick with humidity. As he turned it, the mechanism clicked, a sound like a gunshot in a library. He stepped into the hallway. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered with a manic stroboscopic intensity, casting long, jerking shadows that seemed to dance on the peeling wallpaper. The air here was thicker, carrying the scent of burnt toast and something copper-sharp, the smell of old pennies or fresh injury. Behdala moved toward the stairwell, avoiding the elevator. The metal box was a coffin waiting to be sealed. The carpet in the hallway, once a dull beige, was marred by dark, erratic streaks that he refused to inspect closely. From behind door 4B, a sound emerged, a wet tearing noise, rhythmic and obsessive, accompanied by a low, guttural weeping that didn't sound entirely human. Behdala tightened his grip on the iron pipe, his knuckles white, his breath hitching in his throat. He didn't stop. He couldn't. The directive was clear in his mind. Reach the extraction point, the last stop, the central metro station where the military had promised evacuation trains. It was a lie, perhaps, but it was the only lie available to believe. He pushed through the fire door, the heavy steel groaning on its hinges. The stairwell was a vertical echo chamber. Shouts, screams, and the thud of bodies against walls reverberated from the floors below, creating a cacophony of panic. He began his descent, taking the steps 2 at a time, his boots slamming against the concrete with a rhythmic urgency. On the 3rd landing, he froze. A figure stood in the shadows of the corner, facing the wall. It was Mr. Henderson, the elderly man who always complained about the recycling bins. But Mr. Henderson was twitching, his body seizing in rapid, unnatural spasms. Behdala whispered a name, a foolish reflex of civility. The figure stopped twitching. Slowly, agonizingly, it turned. In the dim emergency lighting, Henderson's face was a ruin of unrecognizable textures, his eyes clouded with a milky, toxic film, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream that exposed gums black with rot. This was the enemy. The Talaham, the struggle, had begun. Henderson lunged, not with the frailty of age, but with the ballistic force of a predator. Behdala reacted on instinct, raising the pipe in a defensive guard. The impact was jarring, sending a shockwave up his arms. They collided, a tangle of limbs and desperation in the claustrophobic concrete box. Behdala could smell the decay rolling off the man in waves, a sickly sweet odor of fermented fruit and stagnation. He shoved, putting his weight behind the blow, sending the creature stumbling back down the stairs.
Behdala didn't wait to see the result. He vaulted the railing, landing hard on the next flight, his ankles protesting, and sprinted down, down into the belly of the madness. Bursting out of the lobby doors and onto the street was like stepping into a riot inside a furnace. The heat was physical, a wall of temperature generated by burning cars and thousands of bodies pressing against one another. The avenue was a sea of motion. Cars were gridlocked, abandoned, doors open like wings, their occupants having fled or died in their seats. Behdala wove through the labyrinth of metal and flesh. He saw a woman dragging a suitcase that had burst open, trailing clothes like entrails across the asphalt, oblivious to the fact that she was being stalked by a pack of shadows darting between the vehicles. The lighting was apocalyptic, orange fires casting long, dancing silhouettes against the buildings, while the crimson flare of emergency strobes painted the smoke in shades of blood.
He kept his head down, the brim of his tactical cap shielding his eyes from the glare. The noise was deafening, sirens, glass breaking, the collective roar of human terror. He reached the perimeter of the metro station. It was a fortress of desperation. Barricades of overturned buses and concrete dividers had been erected, but they were already failing. The crowd was a singular organism, pushing, crushing, climbing over one another to reach the perceived safety of the underground. Behdala saw the military police on the high ground, their silhouettes stark against the blinding floodlights. They were shouting orders that no one could hear, their rifles leveled, but hesitating. Then, the surge happened. The perimeter breached not from the outside, but from within the crowd. The infection was already inside. A ripple of violence tore through the mass of people near the gates. Behdala saw the shift, the way the panic turned from flight to fight. He scrambled up the side of a delivery truck to escape the crush, his boots slipping on the sleek metal. From his vantage point, he witnessed the fall of the last stop. It wasn't a battle. It was a tidal wave. The shadows he had seen earlier, the infected, were swarming with a hive mind intensity, tearing through the barricades. The floodlights flickered and died, plunging the station entrance into a terrifying twilight, illuminated only by the frantic beams of flashlights and the muzzle flashes of useless resistance. Behdala stood atop the truck, the iron pipe heavy in his hand, the wind whipping dust into his eyes. He was alone in a sea of millions, a singular point of defiance against the encroaching dark. The extraction was gone. The evacuation was a myth. There was only the night, the heat, and the hunger waiting in the dark. He tightened his grip. He would not go quietly. The metal of the delivery truck groaned, a low tectonic complaint beneath his boots. It wasn't the wind. It was the impact of 1,000 bodies slamming against the chassis, a fleshy tide seeking purchase on the sleek aluminum. Behdala didn't look down. Looking down was for the dead. He looked out, scanning the horizon of the apocalypse, his eyes adjusting to the jagged twilight created by the erratic strobing of dying flashlights and the distant rhythmic muzzle flashes of a heavy machine gun nest that was rapidly running out of ammo. The air tasted of copper and ozone, a thick metallic soup that coated the back of his throat. He swung the iron pipe. It was a reflex now, a muscle memory carved into his synapses over the last 6 hours. The heavy steel connected with a wet thud against a hand that had crested the roof of the truck. Fingers, blue, broken, nails torn away, scrabbled for a moment on the smooth surface before sliding back into the abyss below. There was no scream from the owner of that hand. That was the worst part. The screaming had stopped being human 20 minutes ago. Now it was just a collective, wet roar, the sound of a slaughterhouse floor tilted at a 45-degree angle. Behdala took a breath, holding it in his lungs to burn away the panic. He needed a route. The evacuation point, the last stop, was a kill box. The military barricades, heavy concrete jersey barriers topped with razor wire, had held for maybe an hour. But the infected, they didn't care about pain. They didn't care about wire. They just pushed. The front ranks were shredded, flayed alive by the wire, their bodies forming a ramp of meat and bone for the thousands behind them to climb over. Behdala had watched it happen with a detached, cold horror. It was simple physics, fluid dynamics applied to human biology. Enough pressure, and the dam breaks. He turned his gaze to the east, toward the train depot's main terminal. It was a brutalist structure of concrete and shattered glass, looming over the parking lot like a tombstone. If there was a way out, it was through the tunnels underneath. The surface was lost. The sky belonged to the smoke, and the ground belonged to them. "Move, Bert," he whispered to himself, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. "Move or become the pavement." He backed up 3 paces, the truck swaying violently now as the Swan began to rocket, trying to tip the obstacle. He sprinted. The gap between the delivery truck and the roof of a stalled commuter bus was 7 feet. In a world before today, that was a distance to measure carefully. Tonight, it was just a gap between living and dying. Behdala launched himself. For a split second, he was suspended over the crowd. He saw them clearly in the strobe of a flare gun fired from somewhere below. Upturned faces, mouths unhinged, eyes distinctively empty, reflecting the red phosphorus light like polished stones. They reached for him, a forest of grasping limbs, a hunger so palpable it felt like heat. He landed hard on the bus roof, rolling to absorb the impact. The metal bit into his shoulder, tearing his jacket, but he was up instantly. The pipe was still in his hand. Good. He couldn't lose the pipe. It was the only truth left. This vantage point offered a new, grim perspective. The bus was surrounded. Inside, through the translucent escape hatch, he could see movement. Shadows wrestling shadows. The passengers hadn't gotten out. The infection had gotten in. He heard the muffled thumping of bodies against the roof from the inside, a frantic drumming that sounded like rain. He ignored it. Empathy was a luxury.
Empathy was weight. He scanned the terminal entrance. The glass doors were gone, shattered inward. A pile of luggage, suitcases, backpacks, teddy bears formed a chaotic barricade that had already been breached. But above the entrance, on the concrete overhang, he saw a maintenance ladder. It was retracted, the bottom rung dangling 12 feet off the ground, too high to jump. But the overhang, if he could get to the overhang. He navigated the roof of the bus, stepping over the ventilation units. To his left, the screams of the evacuation zone were changing pitch. The heavy machine gun had gone silent. The tidal wave had reached the soldiers. The sound that followed was the tearing of Velcro, magnified 1,000 times, the sound of Kevlar and flesh being ripped apart. Behdala jumped to the roof of a station wagon, the thin metal buckling under his weight. He was lower now, closer to the Horde. A hand shot out, grabbing his ankle. The grip was iron. He didn't scream, he stomped. He brought his heavy boot down on the wrist, feeling the radius and ulna snap. The hand went limp. He scrambled forward, vaulting over the hood of the car, landing on the trunk of a taxi. He was 10 yards from the terminal wall. Between him and the wall was a gap of churning bodies. No cars, just people. Infected people, snapping, biting, clawing. To fall was to be erased. He looked around. A light pole. It had been knocked askew by a fleeing armored personnel carrier, leaning precariously toward the terminal overhang. It was a 40-degree angle of slick painted steel. Bad idea, Behdala muttered. Terrible idea. He did it anyway. He leapt from the taxi to the base of the pole. The metal vibrated against his chest. He shimmied up, his boot slipping. Below him the heads turned. They saw him. A fresh scent, a pulse. They surged toward the pole, their bodies slamming into it, shaking it like a ripe fruit tree. Behdala scrambled, his fingernails tearing against the paint. He was 10 feet up when the first hand brushed his boot. He kicked out blindly, connecting with the jaw. He pulled himself higher. The pole groaned, tilting further. It wasn't anchored well anymore. The concrete at the base was cracking. Come on, he hissed, teeth gritted. He reached the curve of the lamp. The overhang was right there, 5 feet away. The pole was tilting fast now, descending toward the crowd like a falling tree. He had to time it. If he jumped too soon, he'd miss. Too late, and he'd ride the pole down into the teeth of the swarm. Gravity took over. The pole swooned. Behdala coiled his muscles. As the arc of the fall brought him parallel with the concrete lip of the overhang, he launched. His fingers hooked the edge. Concrete dust exploded into his eyes.
His body slammed into the wall, winding him. He dangled there, 60 feet above the chaos. His grip was slipping. Sweat and grit made his hands slip. He could hear them below, a cacophony of snapping teeth waiting for the drop. He roared, a primal sound that tore from his throat, and hauled himself up. He rolled onto the flat, gravel-covered roof of the terminal overhang, gasping for air that smelled of burning rubber. He lay there for a second, staring at the sky. The stars were invisible, choked out by the smoke of the burning city.
The moon was a sickly bruise behind the clouds. He didn't stay down. He couldn't. He crawled to the edge and looked down. The pole he had ridden was now buried under a mound of bodies. They were tearing at it, tearing at each other in their frustration. It was a frenzy of biological imperative. Behdala stood up and brushed the gravel from his palms. He retrieved the iron pipe from where he had shoved it in his belt. He walked to the maintenance ladder he had seen earlier. It led up to the main roof, but he needed to go down. He needed the tunnels. He bypassed the ladder and moved toward the shattered windows of the second-floor offices. He stepped through the broken frame. The office was a wreck. Papers were everywhere, a snowstorm of invoices and manifests. Cubicles were overturned. There was blood on the walls, spray patterns that told stories of sudden, violent violence. But it was quiet here. The roar of the outside was muffled, distant. He moved through the dark, stepping over a body in a security guard uniform. The man's throat was gone. His gun was missing. Behdala checked the belt. A flashlight. He took it. He checked the pockets. A pack of gum and a lighter. He took those too. Survival was scavenging. He clicked the light on, keeping the beam low and shielded with his hand. The beam cut through the dust motes, revealing a long corridor. The exit signs flickered with a dying emergency battery power, casting intermittent green glares on the carnage. He needed the stairwell. He moved silently, his boots rolling heel to toe. He had learned that years ago, or maybe minutes ago. Time was fluid now. Every corner was a potential ambush. He reached the stairwell door. It was propped open with a fire extinguisher. Bad sign. It meant traffic. He peered into the shaft. It went down into the bowels of the station. He could hear movement, scuffing, heavy breathing. Not the feral panting of the infected, but the terrified, ragged breathing of survivors. He descended. 1 flight, 2 flights. At the landing of the ground floor, he stopped. The door to the main concourse was glass, and through it, he saw the nightmare. The concourse was a slaughter. The infected had breached the main doors.
Hundreds of people who had been waiting for the last train were trapped. It was a mosh pit of consumption. The floor was slick with red. Behdala watched as a woman in a business suit swung a briefcase at a lunging attacker, only to be tackled by 3 others from behind. They didn't bite immediately. They tore. They pulled. It was efficient. It was swift. He turned away. The ground floor was death. He had to go deeper. The subway platforms, the maintenance tunnels. He continued down the stairs to the sub-basement. The air grew cooler here, damp and smelling of mold and old electricity. The sounds of the massacre above faded to a dull vibration in the concrete. He reached the bottom, a heavy steel door labeled Authorized Personnel Only, Track Access. It was locked. He raised the iron pipe, intending to smash the handle, then stopped. Noise. Noise was death. He holstered the pipe and brought out the lighter. He held it up to the doorframe, looking for gaps. Nothing. Solid steel. He looked around. A ventilation grate near the floor. It was screwed in, but the screws were rusted. He knelt, using the edge of the pipe as a makeshift screwdriver. The first screw stripped. He cursed silently. The second one turned, then the third. He pried the grate open. It was a tight squeeze. Behdala shimmied into the ductwork. It was claustrophobic, smelling of dust and rat droppings. He crawled on his elbows, the iron pipe dragging behind him. The metal rattled softly. He froze, listened. Nothing but the hum of distant ventilation fans. He crawled for what felt like miles. His knees were raw. Finally, he saw light ahead, a grate looking down onto a platform. He peered through the slats. The subway platform. It was dimmer here, lit only by the emergency track lights. There were people, maybe 50 of them, huddled in groups. Some were prying, some were arguing. At the edge of the platform, looking into the dark tunnel, stood a man with a shotgun. He was wearing a transit authority uniform, stained with sweat. "No train is coming," the man yelled, his voice cracking. "We have to walk the tracks." "They're electrified," a woman screamed back. "You'll kill us all." "The power is out," the man shouted. "Look around you. The grate is dead." Behdala pushed the grate up. It clattered onto the platform. 50 heads snapped toward him. The shotgun swung in his direction. "Don't shoot,"
Behdala said, his voice raspy. He lowered himself down, dropping the last few feet. He held his hands up, the iron pipe dangling from one finger. I'm not one of them. The transit cop lowered the gun slightly, but his finger stayed on the trigger. Where did you come from? Upstairs, Behdala said. It's gone. The terminal is overrun. If you stay here, they'll find the stairs.
It's just a matter of time. I told them, the cop said, gesturing to the huddled masses. I told them we have to move. Behdala looked at the crowd. Civilians, families, elderly, children. They were baggage. They were noise. They were slow. The tracks, Behdala said, walking to the edge of the platform. He looked into the black throat of the tunnel. Where do they go? North, the cop said, toward the rail yards. It's open ground. Maybe the military has a perimeter there. Maybe, Behdala said. He didn't believe it. But moving was better than waiting. We can't walk, the woman protested again. My mother, she can't walk that far. Behdala looked at the woman, then at the elderly figure beside her in a wheelchair. He felt a cold pang in his chest, a memory of a time when such things mattered. He pushed it down. Then she stays, Behdala said flatly, or you carry her. But if we stay here, we all feed them. The cruelty of the statement hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The woman looked at him with hatred, but beneath the hatred was realization. She knew he was right. Suddenly a sound echoed from the tunnel mouth, a low, guttural moan that seemed to vibrate the rails. Then another, and another. It wasn't coming from the station above. It was coming from the tracks, from the direction they wanted to go. The transit cop paled. They're in the tunnels. Behdala gripped his pipe. They're everywhere. The moans grew louder, multiplying. It sounded like a wind blowing through a cavern, but the wind was made of voices. Shuffling footsteps slapped against the wet concrete of the tunnel floor. Shadows detached themselves from the darkness. Back! The cop screamed. Get back! He fired. The shotgun boom was deafening in the enclosed space. The flash illuminated the tunnel for a split second. They were there, dozens of them, workers in orange vests, commuters, homeless who lived in the dark, all turned, all hungry. They were stumbling over the rails, moving toward the noise. They're blocking the exit, Behdala said. He looked behind him. The stairs up were death. The tracks north were blocked. They were boxed in. The south tunnel, a man in a business suit yelled. What about south? Dead end, the cop shouted, pumping the shotgun. Maintenance spur, no exit. Then we make one, Behdala said. He scanned the platform. There was a stationary train on the south track, dark, silent. The train, is it locked? I don't know, the cop stammered, firing another round into the encroaching mass. Behdala sprinted toward the silent train. He tried the doors between the cars, locked. He swung the iron pipe, smashing the window of the conductor's cab. He reached in, unlocking the door from the inside. He slid it open.
Get in, he roared to the crowd. Get in the train. Panic broke. The herd instinct took over. They trampled each other to get to the door. Behdala stood by the entrance, grabbing people and shoving them inside. He wasn't saving them out of kindness. He was using them. If the infected swarmed, they needed targets that weren't him. The transit cop was retreating, firing blindly now. The Horde was climbing onto the platform. The first of them, a creature that had once been a tall man in a trench coat, lunged at the cop. The shotgun clicked empty. The creature tackled him. The scream was cut short by a wet crunch. Behdala didn't wait. He kicked a man who was trying to push past a child, sending him sprawling into the car, and then jumped in himself. He slammed the heavy sliding door shut just as a body slammed against the outside glass. A face pressed against the window. The transit cop. Blood poured from his mouth. His eyes were wide, pleading. Then he was jerked backward into the darkness. The window smeared red. Inside the car, it was pitch black. The air was heavy with the smell of sweat, urine, and terror. People were sobbing. Someone was praying loudly. Shut up, Behdala hissed. Everyone shut up. Silence fell, broken only by the sniffling of children and the thudding of bodies against the outside of the train. They were surrounded. The train was a metal coffin. Behdala moved to the front of the cab. He checked the controls. Dead. No power. He looked out the front windshield. The maintenance spur ended in a concrete wall about 50 yards down. But to the right,
To the right, illuminated by the faint glow of the infected pushing against the train, he saw a service door in the tunnel wall. "There's a door," he whispered. "Service hatch." "We can't go out there," the woman with the mother whispered. "They're all over the platform." "They're on the platform," Behdala said, his mind racing. "Not on the tracks. Not on this side yet. They're focused on the doors where the noise was." He looked at the group. "I'm going for the door. Anyone who wants to live follows. Anyone who wants to wait in this tin can until they break the glass, feel free." He didn't wait for a vote. He manually cracked the door on the opposite side of the train, the side facing the wall, away from the platform. He peered out. The space between the train and the tunnel wall was narrow, maybe 2 feet. It was dark, empty. He slipped out. The air was cold. He edged along the side of the train, the metal cool against his back. He could hear the infected pounding on the other side, clawing at the windows. The distraction was working. He reached the front of the train and sprinted the short distance to the service door. It was heavy iron, rusted.
He grabbed the wheel handle. It wouldn't budge. "Help me," he hissed. 2 men had followed him, the man in the suit and a younger guy, maybe 20, wearing a gym hoodie. They grabbed the wheel. Together, they heaved. The rust screamed, a high-pitched shriek that echoed in the tunnel. On the platform, heads turned. The infected stopped pounding on the train. They looked at the gap between the cars. They saw the movement. "Push!" Behdala roared. The door gave way with a groan, swinging inward. Darkness yawned beyond. Damp, stagnant air rushed out. "Go!" Behdala shoved the kid through. The suit followed. Behdala looked back. The woman was trying to get the wheelchair out of the train door. It was stuck. "Leave it!" he yelled. "No!" The infected were pouring over the coupling between the cars. They were on the tracks now. Behdala saw the lead creature, a woman with half her face missing, sprint toward him. She was fast. Unnaturally fast. Behdala made the choice. He stepped through the door and slammed it shut. He spun the wheel from the inside. He heard the woman scream. He heard the wheelchair tip. Then he heard the wet, tearing sounds. He squeezed his eyes shut for a second, then opened them. The darkness was absolute. "Light," he said. "Give me the light." The kid fumbled with his phone. The flashlight app turned on. The beam revealed a rough-hewn tunnel, carved from bedrock. Old, older than the subway. This was 19th century brickwork. A sewer. A smuggler's tunnel. "Where are we?" the suit asked, his voice trembling. "Away," Behdala said. "That's all that matters." They walked. The tunnel sloped downward. The ground was slick with slime. Rads scurried away from the light, their eyes glowing red. Behdala kept the lead, the iron pipe ready. He checked his watch. It had been broken in the fall. Time was gone. After what felt like an hour, the tunnel widened into a circular chamber. In the center was a massive cistern, filled with black water. And on the other side, a ladder going up. "Up," the kid said. "Does it go to the surface?" "Let's hope," Behdala said. They skirted the cistern. The water rippled. Behdala paused. He shone the light on the water. Ripples. Concentric circles. Something had moved beneath the surface. "Keep moving," he said, picking up the pace. Fast. They reached the ladder. Behdala went first. He climbed. The rungs rusted and slippery. He pushed against a manhole cover at the top. It was heavy. He braced his back against the ladder and shoved with his shoulders. It lifted. Cool night air rushed in. He slid the cover aside and climbed out. He was in an alleyway. Brick walls on either side. Dumpsters overflowing with trash. He pulled the others up. They stood in the alley, breathing hard. The city was burning around them.
The sky was an orange haze. Sirens wailed in the distance, a hopeless, mechanical dirge. "We made it," the suit whispered. "We're out." Behdala looked at the end of the alley. It opened onto a main avenue. He walked to the edge and looked out. The street was gridlocked, cars abandoned, doors open. But it wasn't empty. It was a river of them. Thousands, moving in a single direction. West.
toward the bridges, toward the safe zones. "We're not out," Behdala said softly. "We're just downstream." He looked at his companions. The kid was checking his phone. No signal. The suit was wiping bile from his mouth. "The military," the suit said. "They'll have the bridges held. We just need to get to the bridge." Behdala shook his head. He pointed to the sky. Above the smoke, barely visible, were the blinking lights of aircraft, fast movers, fighters. "They aren't holding the bridges," Behdala said, the realization settling in his gut like a stone. "They're sealing them." As if on cue, a distant rumble shook the ground. A flash of white light erupted on the horizon, toward the suspension bridge. A second later, the sound hit them, a thunderclap that rattled the teeth in their skulls. The bridge was gone. "They're trapping us in," Behdala said. "Containment. Level 4. The kid dropped his phone. "So we're dead." Behdala gripped his iron pipe until his knuckles turned white. He looked at the burning city, at the river of monsters, at the uncaring sky. "Not yet," he said. "We need high ground, we need weapons, and we need to get away from the herd." He turned back to the alley. There was a fire escape on the building to their left. It was retracted, but he could reach it with a dumpster boost. "Up," he commanded. "We go vertical. The streets are lava." They climbed, first floor, second floor. They reached the roof of the tenement building. From here, the view was apocalyptic. The city was a grid of fire and darkness. In the streets below, the swarms moved like ants, guided by a terrifying collective intelligence. Behdala walked to the edge of the roof. He saw a water tower on the next building over, a good vantage point, a place to rest, to plan. "What's your name?" the suit asked, joining him at the edge. Behdala looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. The man was soft, expensive suit, manicured hands. He wouldn't last the night, but for now he was extra eyes. "Bert," Behdala lied. It was easier than Behdala, just Bert. "I'm David," the suit said. "This is Leo." "David, Leo," Behdala nodded. "Don't get bit, don't fall behind, and if you turn, I will kill you. Do you understand?" David swallowed hard, then nodded. "I understand." Good. Behdala looked back at the city. The last stop had fallen. The extraction was a myth.
The bridges were blown. There were rats in a burning cage, but rats were survivors. Rats knew how to hide. Rats knew how to bite. He checked the pipe. It was bent slightly from the impacts. It was covered in dried gore. It was beautiful. "Let's go," Behdala said. "The night is still young." They moved across the rooftops, silhouettes against the burning sky, heading deeper into the city, away from the evacuation zones, away from the hope that it killed so many others. They moved into the dark, where the rules were simple. Kill or be killed. Eat or be eaten. And Behdala was starving for survival. The wind atop the tenement blocked out the screams, replacing the human misery with the roar of a furnace. The city wasn't just burning, it was breathing, inhaling oxygen and exhaling ash. Bert tasted it on his tongue. It tasted like copper and burnt plastic. A vintage year for the apocalypse. "Keep low," Bert whispered, though the wind snatched the words away. He didn't turn around to see if David and Leo were complying, if they stood up and caught a stray snipe around, or drew the attention of the things clambering up the fire escapes. That was natural selection at work. Bert was a fan of natural selection. It was the only honest system left. They navigated the tar-paper landscape of the roof, stepping over vents that spewed heat from the dying building below. David, the man in the suit, moved with the frantic, jerky energy of a rabbit sensing a fox. He kept checking his watch, a useless reflex. Time had stopped mattering the moment the sirens died. Leo was different, the quiet one. He moved heavier, his eyes glazed, shock acting as a natural anesthetic. He was dangerous, Bert decided. Shock wore off. When it did, noise usually followed. "There," Bert pointed with the lead pipe.
The weapon was an extension of his arm now, fused to his grip by sweat and drying blood. He pointed toward a gap between their building and the next, a luxury high-rise called the Obsidian. It was sleek, black glass, reflecting the fires of the city like a dark mirror. "We can't jump that," David stammered, staring at the alleyway 4 stories down. It was a black throat swallowed by shadows. "You can," Bert said, his voice flat, devoid of comfort. "Or you can stay here. The stairwell door we just welded shut. They're already chewing through it. Hear them?" David froze. Beneath the wind there was a sound, not pounding, but scratching, thousands of fingernails eroding the steel, wet thuds of bodies pressing against bodies, squeezing the ones at the front through the cracks. "I'm going," Bert said. He didn't run. He flowed. He approached the ledge with a rhythmic trot, planted his boot on the crumbling parapet, and launched.
For a second, he was airborne, a silhouette against the burning moon, his coat flapping like ragged wings. He landed on the gravel roof of the Obsidian, rolling instantly to disperse the impact, coming up in a crouch, pipe raised, silent. He looked back. David was trembling on the ledge. Leo stood behind him, staring at nothing. "Jump," Bert mouthed. He tilted his head, his eyes widening slightly, a mimicry of encouragement that looked more like a threat. David jumped. He flailed, his dress shoes slipping on the takeoff. He hit the edge of the Obsidian's roof with his chest, the breath leaving him in a wet gasp. He scrabbled at the gravel, legs kicking in the empty air over the alley. Bert watched. He watched the man struggle, watched the panic flare in his eyes. He counted to 3. 1, 2, 3. Then he stepped forward, grabbed David by the back of his expensive suit jacket, and hauled him onto the roof, like a sack of wet laundry. "Leo," David wheezed, rolling onto his back. Leo didn't jump. He just walked to the edge. He looked down into the alley, then across at Bert. There was something dead in Leo's eyes. Not infected dead, just empty. He stepped off. It wasn't a jump. It was a fall with style. He landed hard, stumbling, falling to his knees, scraping palms raw on the stones. But he made it. He didn't make a sound. "Good," Bert said, turning away. "The rich people lived here. Rich people have pantries. Rich people have heavy doors." They moved to the roof access door of the Obsidian. Locked. Bert didn't bother with lockpicks. He jammed the crowbar end of his pipe into the jamb, finding the leverage point. He leaned into it, listening to the metal groan. He loved that sound, the sound of rules breaking. The lock snapped with a sharp crack that echoed too loudly. Bert froze. He held up a hand. They waited. From the stairwell beyond the door, silence. But not empty silence. Occupied silence. The air pressure was wrong. "Stay behind me," Bert whispered. "If you scream, I break your jaw. Screaming kills us all. A broken jaw just hurts you." He pushed the door open. The stairwell was pristine. Plush carpet, sconces on the walls. It smelled of lavender cleaning fluid and rotting meat. The juxtaposition made Bert smile. It was a funny joke. They descended. 40th floor, 39th, 38th. On the 35th landing, they found the first one. A man in a silk robe, slumped against the wall. He had a martini glass in one hand and a revolver in the other. Half his head was painted on the floral paper wall. "Jesus," David whispered, turning away. Bert stepped closer. He plugged the revolver from the dead man's hand. He checked the cylinder. Empty. He checked the martini glass. And olive remained.
Bert picked up the olive, inspected it for dust, and popped it into his mouth. He chewed slowly, savoring the salty brine, staring into the dead man's remaining eye. "A waste," Bert mumbled. He patted the corpse on the cheek with a cold, intimate familiarity. "Thanks for the hospitality, neighbor." "What are you doing?" David hissed, horrified. "Don't touch him." "He's not using it," Bert said, swallowing the olive pit. "We need to find a unit, secure the perimeter, rest. The city is too hot right now." They pushed into the hallway of the 35th floor. The emergency lights were flickering, casting strobing shadows that made the artwork on the wall seem to move. The carpet muffled their steps, but the silence was heavy, oppressive. It felt like walking inside a lung. Door 3504 was ajar, a sliver of darkness. Bert nudged it open with the pipe. "Hello?" he whispered.
Housekeeping. Nothing. They slipped inside. It was a sprawling penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the hellscape outside. The entire city was a grid of orange fire and black smoke. The bridges to the north were severed, dangling like broken limbs into the river. The extraction zones were smoldering craters. "Look at it," Bert said, walking to the window. He placed a dirty hand on the glass. No more taxes. No more rush hour. Just clarity. "My wife," David sobbed, collapsing onto a leather sofa that cost more than Bert's life earnings. "She was at the stadium. They said go to the stadium." "The stadium is a bowl of soup now," Bert said, not turning around. "Meat soup." "She's gone, David. You're here. Be here." Leo wandered into the kitchen. He opened the fridge. The light inside flickered. "Water," he croaked, his first word in hours. Bert moved to the kitchen. He pushed Leo aside gently but firmly. "Ration it. We don't know when the taps run dry, or if the reservoirs are already tainted with the runoff of 1,000,000 corpses." He found a bottle of sparkling water. He cracked it, taking a modest sip, then passed it to Leo. Leo drank greedily. David didn't move from the couch. "We stay here until dawn?" David asked, his voice hollow. "No," Bert said. He was rummaging through the drawers. He found a chef's knife. High carbon steel. Balanced. He slid it into his belt. "We stay here until the screaming stops, or until it gets closer. Then we move down. The sewers. The subway tunnels. The streets belong to the swarm now. We have to go under." "Under?" David looked up, eyes wide. "It's dark down there. It's a maze. Rats live in the walls, David. Rats live in the dark. We are rats now. Embrace the rodent inside you." Bert smiled. It was a jagged, unsettling expression that didn't reach his eyes.
His eyes were busy scanning the vents, the corners, the shadows. Suddenly, a thump came from the master bedroom. A heavy, wet sound, like a side of beef falling off a hook. Bert held up a finger. "Shh." He signaled Leo to stay by the kitchen. He crept toward the bedroom door, the pipe raised high. The door was closed. He turned the handle. Locked. He knelt, putting his ear to the wood. He could hear breathing, ragged, fluid-filled gasps, and something else, a low, rhythmic muttering. "So hungry, so cold, make it stop, baby, baby." Bert stood up. He looked at the door. He looked at David. "Someone's home. Is it a survivor?" David asked, hope flaring dangerously in his chest. He stood up. "Sit down," Bert ordered. But David didn't listen. He rushed past Bert. "Hello? We can help you. We have water." "David, no," Bert said. But he didn't grab him this time. He just tightened his grip on the pipe. David unlocked the door. He pushed it open. The smell hit them first, a wall of rot. The master bedroom was a slaughterhouse, but in the center of the bed, illuminated by the red glow of the city outside, sat a woman. She was wearing a torn evening gown. Her skin was gray, veins black and pulsing beneath the surface. She was holding a bundle of blankets. She was rocking it. She looked up. Her eyes were gone, just pools of milky white fluid. Her mouth was a ruin of torn flesh. "Baby," she rasped. The voice was like grinding stones. David froze. "Ma'am?" The woman shrieked. It wasn't human. It was the sound of a tearing sheet magnified 1,000 times. She launched herself off the bed, covering the distance to David in a blur of unnatural speed. She hit him, knocking him back into the hallway. Her teeth snapped inches from his throat. "Get her off," David screamed, holding her shoulders, his arms shaking as he fought the impossible strength of the infection. Bert moved. He didn't rush. He stepped in, calculated the angle. He couldn't swing the pipe effectively in the narrow corridor without hitting David. He needed precision. He dropped the pipe. He drew the chef's knife from his belt. He grabbed the woman by her hair. Greasy, matted clumps came away in his hand, but he held on. He yanked her head back, exposing the neck.
The tendons were black and taut. "Shh," Bert whispered into her ear. "Sleep now." He drove the knife into the base of her skull, severing the brainstem. The woman went limp instantly, a puppet with cut strings. She collapsed on top of David, heavy and dead. David scrambled backward, kicking the body away, hyperventilating. She was fast. She was so fast. Bert retrieved his pipe. He wiped the knife on the woman's dress. He leaned down and pulled the blanket bundle from under her arm. He was curious.
He opened the blanket. It wasn't a baby. It was a cat. Or it had been a cat. It was half-eaten. The woman had been saving it for later. "Sentimental," Bert murmured. He dropped the bundle. "We can't stay here." She screamed. "They communicate. Pheromones, sound, I don't know. But the dinner bell just rang." "We just got here," David cried. "And now we leave. That's the life, David. Arrival and departure. No layovers." Bert walked to the front door. He listened. The silence in the hallway was gone. Now there was running. Heavy, slapping footsteps on the carpet, coming from both ends of the hall. "Fire escape?" Leo asked, grabbing a steak knife from the counterblock. "Window," Bert said. He walked to the living room. "We go down the balconies. It's risky. If you slip, you're pavement art. But the hallway is death." He smashed the glass with the pipe. The wind roared into the apartment, scattering papers and swirling the curtains. The noise of the city was deafening now. Bert stepped out onto the balcony. He looked over the rail. The balcony below was 10 feet down. A manageable drop if you had ankles of steel. A death sentence if you hesitated. "I'm going first," Bert yelled over the wind. "If I miss, you can have my pipe." He swung his legs over. He hung by his fingertips for a second, looking at David and Leo. He winked. A slow, terrifying wink. Then he dropped. He landed on the concrete below, absorbing the shock, rolling into the patio furniture. He stood up and waved. Leo went next. He landed hard but stayed upright. David hesitated. The infected were pounding on the apartment door now. Wood splintered. A hand, bloody and missing fingers, punched through the drywall. "David," Bert shouted. "Gravity is your friend. The things behind the door are not." David climbed over. He slipped. He didn't drop. He fell. He hit the railing of the lower balcony with his ribs, a sickening crack echoing. He tumbled onto the floor, screaming in pain. "Shut up," Bert hissed, vaulting over the furniture to clamp a hand over David's mouth. "You want to invite the neighbors from downstairs too?" David's eyes were wide with agony. He nodded, tears streaming into Bert's dirty glove. Bert removed his hand. "My ribs," David wheezed. "Broken." "Can you walk?" Bert asked. I think so." "Good. Walking is mandatory." Bert hauled him up. They repeated the process, floor by floor. It was a grueling, terrifying descent. On the 20th floor, they saw a family eating dinner in their living room. They weren't infected. They were just eating, ignoring the apocalypse. The father saw Bert on the balcony, covered in gore, holding a lead pipe. The father stood up and closed the curtains. "Denial," Bert mused.
Powerful drug. By the time they reached the 4th floor, David was pale and sweating from the pain. Leo was supporting him. Bert was scouting ahead. The 4th floor balcony didn't have a drop. It led to a terrace that connected to the adjacent parking structure, a bridge, a way out of the tower. But the terrace was occupied. 20 of them, maybe 30. They were standing still, faces turned toward the burning moon, swaying slightly. A congregation. They weren't attacking anything. They were just waiting. "We have to go through them," Bert whispered, "to get to the garage ramp." "There's too many," Leo said. "They're dormant," Bert observed. He squinted, like ticks waiting for a heat signature. "We move slow. We move quiet. No sudden movements." "David can barely walk," Leo argued. "Then carry him or leave him." "I'm walking," Bert said. He stepped onto the terrace. He moved among them. He was a shark swimming through a school of tuna. He passed within inches of a man in a delivery uniform whose jaw was hanging by a thread of skin. The infected man twitched, his nostrils flaring. Bert held his breath. He froze. He became a statue. The infected settled. Bert moved on. It was a dance of supreme tension. Leo dragged David, their feet scraping softly. Every scrape sounded like a gunshot to Bert's ears. They were halfway across when David coughed. It was a wet, involuntary spasm from his punctured lung. The terrace went still. The swaying stopped. 30 heads snapped toward them in unison. The sound of vertebrae cracking.
"Run," Bert said, conversational tone. "Run now." The scream began, a collective shriek that shattered the night. The dormant ticks activated. Bert didn't wait for the others. He swung the pipe, taking the head off the nearest infected, a teenager in a varsity jacket. The impact vibrated up his arm, a familiar, comforting shock. He spun, swinging low, shattering the kneecaps of a woman in a business suit. "Go, go, go," he yelled, carving a path. Leo half carried, half threw David toward the garage door. The horde closed in, hands clawed at Bert's coat, teeth snapped at his forearms. He was a whirlwind of violence. He didn't fight with anger, he fought with efficiency. Every swing had a purpose: break a bone, crush a windpipe, create space. He felt teeth sink into the thick leather of his coat sleeve. He didn't pull away. He pushed into the pipe, jamming his arm down the attacker's throat to gag them, then smashed their temple with the pipe handle. "Bert!" Leo screamed from the doorway. Bert kicked a crawler in the face and sprinted. He dove through the doorway, just as Leo slammed the heavy steel fire door. Body slammed against it a second later, a thundering drum roll of flesh.
Bert leaned against the wall, sliding down to the concrete floor. He was panting, but he was smiling. His face was speckled with black blood that wasn't his. "That," Bert wheezed, "was cardio." David was on the floor, coughing up pink froth. We made it." "To the garage," Bert corrected. "We're still high up. We need the street, and the street needs us." He checked his pipe. It was bent further now, a distinct curve in the metal. He wiped it lovingly with a rag from his pocket. "You enjoyed that," Leo said. It wasn't a question. He was looking at Bert with a mix of fear and awe. Bert looked up, his eyes gleaming in the dim emergency lights of the parking garage. "Leo, my boy, most people spend their whole lives pretending they aren't animals, pretending they don't want to bite back when the world kicks them. Tonight, the pretense is over. I'm not enjoying it. I'm just finally being myself." He stood up. He cracked his neck. "Now," Bert said, pointing down the spiraling ramp into the darkness of the lower levels. "Down we go, into the belly of the beast. The subway station is 3 blocks east once we hit the street. If we're lucky, the rats haven't eaten the tracks yet." He began to walk, his silhouette long and distorted against the concrete wall. "Come along, children. It's almost feeding time." The garage was a tomb of cars. Mercedes, BMWs, Teslas, all silent, dusty coffins. Some had bodies inside. Some had shattered windows. Bert ignored them. He was listening for the echo. The acoustics of a parking garage were treacherous. A sound made on level 4 could sound like it was on level 2. They reached the ground floor exit. The metal grate was down. "Locked," David groaned. "Nothing is locked," Bert said, just hesitant. He found a manual override chain. He pulled. The gears shrieked, a sound that made them all cringe. The gate rose 6 inches, then stuck. "Stuck," Bert grunted, hanging his weight on the chain. "Let me help," Leo said. Together they hauled on the chain. Rusty gears ground together. The gate rose. 1 foot, 2 feet, enough to crawl under. Bert went first. He rolled out onto the sidewalk. The street level was different. Up on the roofs it was wind and smoke. Down here it was humid. The air was thick with the smell of opened bowels and spilled gasoline. The streetlights were dead. The only light came from burning cars and the flickering neon of a pawn shop down the block. And the bodies, they were everywhere, piled in gutters, draped over hydrants, some moving, some not. "Stay in the shadows," Bert whispered. "The subway entrance is there, past the bus." A city bus sat sideways across the road, its windows smashed, its interior a dark cavern. They moved toward it, crouching behind parked cars.
As they neared the bus, a sound stopped them. Click, click, click. It wasn't a footstep. It was hard material on asphalt. Bert peeked around the bumper of a taxi. In the intersection, illuminated by a burning trash can, was something new. It was big, bloated. It looked like 2 fused bodies, a mass of tumors and muscle. It walked on 4 limbs, knuckles dragging. It had no eyes, just a row of sensory pits along its forehead. "What is that?" David whimpered, too loud. The thing's head snapped toward them. The sensory pits flared. "A mutation," Bert whispered, fascination warring with survival instinct. "Rapid evolution, or maybe just a mistake. It doesn't matter. It heard you." The thing let out a roar that vibrated in their chests. It charged. It was fast, faster than the runners.
It plowed through a pile of trash cans, sending them flying like toys. "The subway," Bert yelled. "Run, forget the stealth." They broke cover. They sprinted for the subway stairs. The beast was gaining. Bert could hear its wet, heavy breathing, the slap of its massive hands on the pavement. David lagged behind. The pain in his ribs was slowing him down. Bert reached the subway entrance, a wrought iron gate, half open. He slid through. Leo followed. David was 10 feet away. The beast was 20. "Come on," Leo screamed, reaching his hand through the bars. David lunged. He tripped on a curb. He fell. The beast was on him. It didn't bite. It smashed. A fist the size of a cinder block came down. Bert didn't look away. He watched. I saw the red mist. I heard the wet crunch that ended David's story. The suit didn't save him. The watch didn't save him. "Close the gate," Bert said calmly. "We have to help him," Leo cried, grabbing the bars. "He's paced, Leo. Close the gate." The beast looked up from its meal. It roared at them, blood dripping from its sensory pits. It charged the gate. Leo and Bert slammed the iron gate shut. Bert jammed his pipe through the handles just as the beast slammed into it. The metal buckled. Dust rained down from the tiled ceiling of the subway entrance. The beast clawed at the bars, swiping inches from Bert's face. Bert didn't flinch. He stared into the eyeless face. "Ugly," Bert judged, "but effective." The beast hammered again, but the gate held, for now. "David is dead," Leo said, sliding down the wall, trembling. "He's just dead." "He was dead when he put on that suit this morning," Bert said, adjusting his coat. "He just didn't know it yet. You're alive, Leo. Focus on that." Bert turned and looked down the stairs, into the black throat of the subway. The air coming up was cool, damp, and smelled of old electricity and stagnant water. "One way forward," Bert said.
He clicked on a small flashlight he'd taken from the dead man in the apartment. He put his hand over the lens, allowing only a sliver of light to escape. "The last stop," Bert whispered, stepping onto the escalator that would never move again. "Let's see what's waiting for us on the platform." They descended into the dark, leaving the burning city above, trading the fire for the tomb. Bert hummed a tune, a lullaby. It echoed softly against the tiles, more terrifying than the silence. The darkness wasn't empty. It was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against the eardrums and settled in the lungs. The air grew colder with every step down the immobile escalator, the ridges of the metal steps biting into the soles of their shoes. Above them, the banging on the gate had ceased, replaced by a wet, tearing sound that Leo desperately tried not to visualize. He kept his eyes on the sliver of light coming from Bert's stolen flashlight, a pale beam that cut through the dust motes, dancing in the stagnant draft. "Don't look up," Bert said, his voice low and devoid of the trembling frequency that infected Leo's own. "Gravity is the only law left. Things fall down, fluids, debris, bodies. Keep your eyes on your feet." Leo gripped the rubber handrail. It was tacky, coated in a residue of decades of commuter sweat, now cooling rapidly. "Where are we going, Bert?" "The announcement said the station was sealed." "The announcements were recorded by people who went home 3 hours ago," Bert replied, skipping a step where a discarded suitcase lay open, vomiting clothes onto the steel teeth of the stairs. "Or people who are currently trying to eat their coworkers. The infrastructure remains, Leo. The tunnels connect. If the city is burning, we go under the fire. We become the worms." They reached the mezzanine level. The vast tiled hall was bathed in the sickly, intermittent strobe of a failing emergency light. It pulsed like a dying heart. Red, black, red, black. Each flash revealed a tableau of frozen chaos. The turnstiles were jammed with luggage and abandoned strollers. Papers blew across the floor in the draft from the tunnels below. Newspapers with headlines that were already ancient history, crumpled flyers, tickets. But it was the smell that hit Leo first. It wasn't just the ozone of the subway. It was copper and voided bowels. The smell of fear turned primal. "Quiet now," Bert whispered, clicking off the flashlight. He moved with a disturbing grace, his oversized trench coat swaying silently, his posture hunched, not out of fear, but out of a predatory crouch. He blended into the shadows between the Wren pulses.
Why did you turn it off? Leo hissed, reaching out, his fingers brushing the rough fabric of Bert's coat.
Because we are not the only shoppers in the market, Bert murmured. He took Leo's wrist, his grip like a vice, and pulled him behind a concrete pillar wrapped in a peeling advertisement for a teeth-whitening service. The model's smile seemed predatory in the red light. They waited. In the silence, Leo heard it. Scuffing. Leather on tile. Heavy, wet breathing. Not the rapid, panicked breathing of a runner, but the slow, congested rasp of something trying to clear its airways. A figure shuffled past the turnstiles. In the red flash, Leo saw a transit cop. His uniform was torn at the shoulder, the dark blue fabric stained black. He was dragging his baton on the ground, the metal tip tracing a screeching line on the tiles. He stopped near the ticket booth. He turned his head, and the red light caught the wet sheen of his face. His jaw hung loose, unhinged, swaying slightly with his movements. He wasn't looking for tickets. Is he sick? Leo breathed, the words barely audible. He's resigned, Bert whispered back, a hint of dark amusement in his tone. He's quit the force. Watch. From the shadows of the ticket booth, another shape lunged. It was fast, blurringly fast. It tackled the transit cop with a sound like a wet sandbag hitting pavement. There was no shout of arrest, no demand for compliance, just the sound of tearing fabric and the snap of cartilage. The cop didn't scream. He just grunted, a wet, gurgling sound, as the two shapes rolled on the floor in a macabre embrace. Natural selection, Bert said, adjusting his glasses in the dark. Accelerated. Come. While they are. Intimate. Bert moved away from the pillar, skirting the edge of the mezzanine, keeping to the wall. Leo followed, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. They passed a newsstand, the racks overturned. Bert paused for a microsecond, his hand snatching something from the floor, a packet of beef jerky. He tore it open with his teeth and shoved a piece into his mouth, chewing methodically as they fast walked past the carnage. How can you eat? Leo chubbed out. Fuel, Bert swallowed. The machine needs coal, Leo. Empathy burns calories. Horror burns calories. If you don't replace them, you stop moving. If you stop moving, you become the meal. Do you want a piece? Teriyaki? Leo shook his head violently, bile rising in his throat. Suit yourself. Bert pocketed the rest. Waste not. They reached the stairs leading down to the platform. Here the air was different, denser. The roar of the city above was gone, replaced by a low, electrical hum, the third rail, singing in the dark, and something else, a murmuring, a collective sound of hundreds of voices, hushed, terrified, echoing off the curved ceramic tiles of the tunnel.
There are people, Leo said, a wave of relief washing over him. Bert, there are people down there. That, Bert said, stopping at the top of the stairs, is the most dangerous thing we've encountered all night. They're survivors. We can help each other. Bert turned to look at Leo. Even in the gloom, his eyes seemed to reflect the meager light, flat and unblinking. A drowning man will climb a ladder made of his own children to get a breath of air, Leo. A crowd in a panic is a single organism with 1,000 legs and no brain. We do not join the herd. We use the herd. You're a monster, Leo whispered. I'm a narrative device, Bert said cryptically. I move the plot forward. You're the one stuck in the backstory. Now move. They descended. The platform was packed. Hundreds of people were pressed shoulder to shoulder, standing on the yellow tactile warning strips, peering into the black tunnel. Flashlight beams crisscrossed the darkness, searching for the twin lights of a train. Some were crying. Others were arguing in hushed, angry tones. A man in a business suit was holding a golf club. A woman was clutching a cat carrier so tightly her knuckles were white. Bert didn't enter the crowd. He stayed in the shadows of the stairwell, observing. He watched the dynamics. The weak were being pushed to the back, near the walls. The aggressive were claiming the edge, ready to fight for a spot on a train that might never come. The last stop, Bert murmured to himself. End of the line. Suddenly, the rails began to vibrate. A low rumble grew from the depths of the tunnel. The crowd surged forward, a collective gasp sucking the air out of the station. It's coming, someone screamed. Back up! Let people off! Another yelled, though there was nowhere to back up to. Lights appeared in the tunnel,
bright, blinding LED headlamps. The train horn blasted, not the polite toot of arrival, but a long, desperate blare. The brakes screeched, sparks showering from the wheels like fireworks, illuminating the terrified faces of the mob. The train skidded into the station, moving too fast. It overshot the stopping marker, screeching metal on metal before jolting to a halt. The cars were dark. No interior lights. The windows were smeared with something dark. White, Bert said, his hand shooting out to grab Leo's collar, preventing him from rushing forward. Look at the windows. Leo squinted. Handprints. Hundreds of handprints on the inside of the glass, streaked downwards. Open the doors, the crowd screamed, hammering on the exterior of the train. They can't get out, Bert whispered, and we shouldn't let them out. But the crowd didn't care. A large man with a tire iron smashed the glass of the nearest door. The safety glass shattered into diamonds.
It happened in seconds. The pressure inside the car was released, but it wasn't commuters who spilled out. They poured from the broken window like a fluid, a tangle of limbs, gnashing teeth and gray, feverish skin. The infected inside the train hadn't been trapped. They had been incubating. The train wasn't a rescue. It was a delivery system. The scream that went up from the platform was a sound that would haunt Leo for the rest of his short life. It was the sound of hope turning instantly into agony. The front ranks of the crowd were consumed instantly. The infected, starving and frenzied from their confinement, tore into the living with reckless mechanical violence. Chaos, Bert said, almost reverently. The great equalizer. We have to help them, Leo screamed, reaching for his pocket knife, a useless gesture against the tide. Bert slapped him, hard. The sound cracked through Leo's panic. Look at the tracks, Bert commanded, pointing not at the train, but at the empty track on the other side of the platform. The maintenance door, across the third rail. That is the exit. We can't cross. The rail is live. The train draws the power, Bert said, but the infected are drawing the crowd. The crowd is the distraction. We are the audience leaving early to beat traffic. The slaughter on the platform was absolute. The mob tried to retreat up the stairs, but they were trampled by their own panic. The infected were climbing over heads, leaping from the train roof. It was a grinder. Bert grabbed Leo and shoved him toward the edge of the platform, away from the train. Jump. I can't. Jump or become the buffet, Bert roared, a rare display of volume. Leo looked back. A woman with half her face missing was reaching for him. He jumped. He hit the gravel of the track bed, his ankle twisting painfully. He scrambled up, terrifyingly aware of the high-voltage rail inches from his shin. Bert landed beside him with a heavy thud, his coat billowing. Move, low, fast. Bert pushed him toward the far wall. They scrambled across the sleepers. The air down here was thick with the smell of grease and hot metal. Above them on the platform, the massacre continued. Blood began to drip over the edge of the platform, pattering onto the tracks like rain. They reached the far wall, a heavy steel door with a warning sign. Danger, high voltage, authorized personnel only. Bert didn't hesitate. He pulled a small pry bar from his deep pockets, another treasure from a dead man, and jammed it into the frame. He leaned his weight into it, his face contorted in a grimace that looked disturbingly like a smile. With a groan of rusted metal, the door popped open. They spilled into a narrow surface corridor, concrete, pipes, dripping water. The roar of the station was muffled instantly as Bert slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolt. Silence returned. Sudden, rinning silence. Leo collapsed against the wall, sliding down until he hit the wet floor. He dry-heaved, his body shaking so violently his teeth clattered. We left them, Leo sobbed. We just watched them die. Bert stood over him, adjusting his cuffs. He took out the flashlight and clicked it on, aiming the beam down the endless, damp corridor. We didn't kill them, Leo. Fate did. Poor planning did. The city did, Bert said calmly. We just declined the invitation to the funeral. You enjoyed it, Leo accused, looking up at the lanky figure looming over him. You liked seeing it. Bert crouched down, bringing his face close to Leo's. The light cast deep shadows in Bert's eye sockets, making him look like a skull. I enjoy efficiency, Leo, and I enjoy breathing. That crowd, they were dead the moment they decided to wait for someone else to save them. They were livestock. We
are the wolves, or at least the rats. Bert stood up and shone the light down the tunnel. This leads to the old drainage outflow, runs under the river, comes out in the marshlands miles from the city center. It's wet, it smells of excrement, and it's full of rats. It is the most beautiful path I have ever seen. Leo struggled to his feet, wiping tears and grime from his face. What happens when we get out? Bert started walking, his footsteps echoing with a rhythmic, confident cadence. Then Leo, then it's day 2, and day 2 is going to be much, much worse. Leo stood there for a moment, looking back at the steel door. He could hear faint thumping on the other side. The feast was over. The hunt was beginning again. He looked at Bert's retreating back, the sway of the coat, the hunch of the shoulders. Creepy Bert, the man who stole flashlights from the dead and ate jerky in a slaughterhouse. Leo realized with a cold, sinking feeling that he wasn't afraid of the monsters anymore. He was afraid of what he would have to become to keep walking next to Bert. "Are you coming?" Bert's voice echoed back, distorted by the tunnel acoustics. "Yes," Leo whispered. He turned his back on the door, on the city, on the world that had existed this morning. He followed the beam of light into the dark. Somewhere ahead, Bert began to hum that lullaby again. It drifted through the dripping pipes, a gentle melody for the end of the world.